Welcome to the Babylonian Podcast. I'm Michael Light, and I'm a Second Temple Jewish literature junkie and a big-time Bible nerd. And on this podcast, I provide the perspective of Jews that lived just before Jesus, from texts that we have like the apocrypha, pseudepigraphon, Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, and more. With scholars, sages, and scriptures, let's Bible on. In this episode of the Babylonian, we are going to be continuing our series on the apocrypha. So if you haven't already seen the first episode, you want to see that. That's on what the apocrypha is, kind of the biblical basis for it, the scriptural mind behind it, the importance of it. And then if you want to do extra research and you haven't already, then you should listen to my second episode of my series on searching the scriptures, which goes into the whole canon. Is it or is it not canon? How has it been seen historically and in the scriptures? And what is the Bible that Jesus read? But yet also its importance at the same time. Also, before we get into this episode, I want to remind you that you can find all my resources on my website, which is either thebabylonian.com or michaeljlight.com. And you can go to Works and Writings and you can click the Apocrypha, and under that you'll see a section for all the different books up until this point in the series. So Tobit, Judith, and now Wisdom of Solomon. You can see the complete overviews if you just click the titles at the top, and you can also see questions I'm asking about the text and the specific references for those, as well as all the biblical references up to the point that I've gotten so far in the year. I just wanted to put that out there at the beginning of this episode before we jump into, so far at this point, my favorite apocryphon. And I'm actually significantly ahead in how far I've read this third time reading through the Apocrypha. But this is still my favorite so far. And it's called The Wisdom of Solomon. Now, again, if you listen to my first podcast episode, there are different ways that different people use the term Apocrypha. For this series in the podcast, I'm using it the way that a lot of people use it, which is books that are outside of the Protestant canon, but inside either Roman Catholic or Orthodox canons. However, I don't prefer that usage. It seems to me that Apocrypha should be a broader term that refers to anything outside of the Hebrew scriptures that Jesus read, which means that it should also include books like 1, 2, and 3 Enoch, 1 and 2 Esdras, which this is in this Apocrypha. It should include Jubilees, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. But those types of scriptures are considered by most as pseudepigrapha. For me, I would say that they're pseudepigrapha and apocrypha. I think that pseudepigrapha is a subgroup of apocrypha rather than a distinct group. Now, this isn't really important if you're not really picky about terms like me, but the whole term apocrypha means hidden. And so the person who named that was Jerome. When he was translating the Latin Vulgate, he was translating the Hebrew scriptures into Latin, as well as the Greek New Testament and the Greek apocrypha, and that's when he made the term for this. He said the Jews don't consider this part of their canon. These are hidden books. So they're books. So that's the type of definition that makes most sense here, is any scripture outside of the canonical scriptures, including pseudepigrapha. Now, pseudepigrapha means falsely attributed writings. So pseudo, right? You get fake, and then graph is like has to do with writing, so fake writings. And so these are writings that are attributed to people that didn't actually write them. And that's not a scandal. Again, if you want to know about that, then you need to listen to my second episode of the season on searching the scriptures. But that would be texts like 1 Enoch. It's written as if it was Enoch, but it's not Enoch. And then there are texts like Jubilees. It's written as if it was written by angels that were handed to Moses with the giving of the law, but it's obviously not. And then the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, it claims to be written by the 12 Patriarchs, but obviously, again, it's not written by the 12 Patriarchs. And that's the exact same, if you couldn't tell, with the book called The Wisdom of Solomon. It claims to be written by Solomon, but it's not. Now, the Wisdom of Solomon doesn't claim in the text that it's written by Solomon. However, the title that was given to it in the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures and other texts into Greek called the Septuagint, that was the first name that was given to it, was the Wisdom of Solomon. But you may just see this text referred to as just plain wisdom, because when Jerome in the 4th century after Christ was translating the Hebrew Scriptures and other Greek Scriptures, Wisdom of Solomon included, when he was translating those, he just gave it the name Wisdom. But the earliest name that we have for it from when it was made is the Wisdom of Solomon. And either way, it's written, even though, again, it doesn't use the name Solomon, it's written from his perspective. And so chapter 7 and chapter 9 kind of write from that perspective. So, for example, chapter 7 opens up by saying, I'm a mortal like everyone else. I'm a descendant of the first formed child of the earth. Just talks about how this person is a normal person. In the first couple of verses, how they were nursed and grew up like normal people. And in verse 5 it says, no king has had a different beginning of existence. So we infer that it's a king, for there's one entrance into life and one way out. Therefore I prayed, and understanding was given me. I called on God, and the spirit of wisdom came to me. And then it makes an allusion to Proverbs 3:14 through 16. It says, I preferred wisdom to scepters and thrones, and I counted wealth as nothing in comparison with her. Neither did I liken to any or priceless gem. And it goes on to how much he desired wisdom. And then it goes into his prayer and how he asked God to give him wisdom, and how God blessed him with that. And that's obviously, it's a king that asks God for wisdom. That's obviously King Solomon, who God blesses with wisdom. And that's, in fact, where the whole wisdom tradition comes from. So even in the canonical scriptures, there are different ways of saying how many wisdom books, what's a wisdom book and what isn't. But with a broader understanding of it, there's Proverbs, which was written by Solomon, or is attributed to being written by Solomon. There are many different Proverbs, some written by Agur, some written by others, but it's mostly attributed to Solomon because he wrote Proverbs. There's Ecclesiastes, which is also tends to be traditionally attributed to Solomon. Psalms, that's more David. There's Job, and there's Song of Songs, which is sometimes called Song of Solomon, and that's somewhat attributed to Solomon because Solomon is mentioned in it. So right there are 5 wisdom texts in the canonical scriptures. But if you're counting this according to the Septuagint and the books that came in the 70 books in total, including those canonical texts and more that were translated into Greek, then you also have the Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus, or the Wisdom of Sirah, or the Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirah. And we'll get into that one next. But the Wisdom of Solomon is one of the 7 wisdom texts in the Septuagint, and the majority of them, again, are connected to Solomon. And so that's in chapter 7, it talks about that, and there's actually a chiasm, so that in chapter 9, again, it shows another prayer where Solomon is asking for mercy, and you can see how this is connected to 1 Kings 3, 6 through 9, and 2 Chronicles 1, 8 through 10. So either way, this book is attributed to Solomon. Besides that, that's really where all the connections end. So, by the way, why I mentioned that, well, that's where we get the name of the book, is because those 2 chapters talk about him asking for wisdom and how he loves it. This is all, it's all poetry, by the way. But it's very, like, my first time reading through it, I didn't really care for it. My second time, which was the last time before this time, I was like, whoa, this is a much better text. And this third time, as I had listened to a lecture on it, and I was reading the comments, the annotations in the Oxford annotated version, and this is definitely my favorite apocryphon right now with that tradition. So let me kind of explain why. So those are the only 2 real connections that it has to Solomon. And so why does it choose Solomon? So obviously it chooses Solomon because he's connected to the wisdom tradition, as I already said. But this text is supposedly written to rulers of the earth. So chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "Love righteousness, you rulers of the earth." And so it's as if it's written to kings. In fact, this is repeated again in chapter 6, verse 1. "Listen, therefore, O kings, and understand. Learn, O judges of the ends of the earth." So it's written as if it was to kings, but it probably was not actually written to kings. In the Wisdom of Solomon, wisdom is so closely connected with God. At the end, there's a part where it starts to retell a lot of the stories in the Torah, but instead of saying that God's doing things, it says that wisdom is doing them. And so it's as if wisdom has, in a sense, become the mediator between God and man. And what God was doing, wisdom is now doing on its behalf. Kind of like, think, for example, the angel of the Lord. In Genesis 16, when he sees Hagar, and he tells Hagar that she's going to be okay and God will be with her, and she goes away and she says, "I have seen the Lord, I have seen Yahweh." It's as if it's distinct from Yahweh and yet not Yahweh. And this is, if you're a Christian, this is really important stuff. Because, ding, 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 you thought about it, Jesus is seen as the wisdom of God. Let me read you something from 1 Corinthians. Okay, so this is 1 Corinthians 1:24. It says, "To those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." So Paul is heavily influenced by this understanding that God's wisdom is both distinct from God and yet God himself. And now I think there was development between this original understanding and Paul's understanding, and there's also a lot of biblical basis for this. For example, in Proverbs 8, which is the principal passage on wisdom, it talks about how wisdom was the first of God's creations, and that it was with him creating all the earth. And so you're like, wait, so there was something else creating other than God? And so the author of the Wisdom of Solomon and a lot of other wisdom traditions, and even Philo of Alexandria, are heavily influenced by Proverbs 8, and that whole idea of wisdom being this thing that's clearly presented as having a very powerful, very important part in creation, and yet being separate from creation, having their own, or being not a creation. But so they're coming from God, and yet it's distinct from God, and that's how God works in the world. And, of course, this has heavy influence on John's writings. Now, I talked about Philo. Philo was a philosopher from the 1st century, about 20 BC to 50 AD. And Wisdom of Solomon, the scholar that wrote the intro to this Oxford annotated version, his name is Michael Kolarczyk. He dates it to 60 or 70 BC. And so just about 50 years before Philo was born. And Philo writes pretty much very similar ideas, but he relates it more to what he calls the logos rather than wisdom. But this is still very similar ideas of something that's distinct from God, but yet still God, and it's a mediating influence in the world. And that's how God acts with creation. And so obviously Philo's logos is very important for understanding the gospel according to John, where it says that the logos was with God and the logos was God. Everything was created through the logos, again, heavily influenced by Proverbs 8. So it's really hard to talk about the New Testament in its Second Temple Jewish background without talking about the wisdom of Solomon or Philo of Alexandria, or this idea of something that's coming from God, distinct from God, and yet God at the same time. I mean, that is what the Trinity is, at least the Father and the Son. And of course, the Spirit is also coming from the Father, I believe, through the Son. But that's a different thing. This is a little bit more complicated. If you don't understand this, that's fine. I would say spend a little bit of time looking into resources on this, and you might have your mind blown, because this is some pretty important, but also just really awesome, super cool stuff that'll just, like I said, it'll blow your mind. And that's one of the reasons why I really like Wisdom of Solomon. Is out of the texts that I've read, this is the earliest that I remember that mentions that. Or that spends some time talking about that. Philo is probably the most explicit about it. So that's one of the reasons why I really like this text. Now, Paul is not just influenced by that in 1 Corinthians, but also Romans chapter 1 is eerily similar to, I believe it's chapter 13 of the Wisdom of Solomon. So let me read, and also a part of chapter 14. So I'm going to first read Romans chapter 1, the part that's very close to this, and then I'll read chapters 13 and 14, and let's see if you can pick up on it. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and injustice of those who, by their injustice, suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling immortal human beings or birds or four-footed animals or reptiles. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way, also, the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious toward parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. Yet they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. Okay, so that's Romans 1. Now let me read Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 13, first, verses 1 through 16. Or wait, sorry, I think that may be earlier. No, sorry. Up to verse 11, we'll see. This is what it says, starting in verse 1. For all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists. Nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works. But they supposed that either fire or wind or swift air, or the circle of the stars, or turbulent water, or the luminaries of heavens were the gods that rule the world. If, through the delight in the beauty of these things, people assume them to be gods, let them know how much better than these is their Lord. For the author of beauty created them. And if people were amazed at their power in working, let them perceive them how much more powerful is the one who formed them. For from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their Creator. Yet these people are little to be blamed, for perhaps they go astray while seeking God and desiring to find Him. For while they live among His works, they keep searching, and they trust in what they see, because the things that are seen are beautiful. Yet again, not even they are to be excused. For if they had the power to know so much that they could investigate the world, how did they fail to find sooner the Lord of these things? But miserable with their hopes set on dead things are those who gave the name gods to the works of human hands. Gold and silver fashioned with skill, and likenesses of animals, or a useless stone, the work of an ancient hand. Okay, so that's chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. And now let me read chapter 14, verses 22 through 24. Then it is not enough for them to err about the knowledge of God, but though living in great strife due to ignorance, they call such great evils peace. For whether they kill children in their initiations, or celebrate secret mysteries, or hold frenzied revels with strange customs, they no longer keep either their lives or their marriages pure. For they either treacherously kill one another, or grieve one another by adultery. And that is closest to the end of Romans chapter 1, verses 28 through 31. But that connection in chapter 14 is less certain, I think, than in chapter 13. Chapter 13, those first 10 verses just seem so very similar. The more towards the beginning, the more similar they are, excuse me, to Romans 1, starting in verse 18. So anyways, that is very, very interesting. And it seems that Paul obviously had Wisdom of Solomon 13 on the brain when he was writing that, especially since both of these are talking about how Gentiles went wrong, they went astray, even though God had revealed Himself through creation. And if they had looked at creation, then they could have seen who the Lord was, supposedly. So they're both making the same arguments with the same points, and the wording is eerily similar. Anyways, with that said, I wanted to jump more into what the actual whole text is talking about and kind of give you an elongated summary of what it has to say, and maybe a little bit more of the significance, because those 2 or 3 things are already really significant. But I also want to talk about the significance of the whole text, as well as 2 or 3 ways that it kind of compares and contrasts the evildoers and the righteous, and how God repays the both, and how that works, because that is very fascinating and profound, in my opinion. And this is just a really great work. Oh, and there's also another biblical reference in Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, a New Testament reference, that is. There are all types of Old Testament references, as you should probably hope there are. But in Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 13, this is what it says. It's a reference, actually, to this larger section. The verses around it are pretty similar to Isaiah 53. But so it's already linked to the crucifixion in that way. But in this way especially, this is what it says in Wisdom of Solomon 2:13. He professes to have knowledge of God and calls himself a child of the Lord. And then listen to this. In Matthew 27:43, this is how they mock Jesus at his crucifixion. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he wants to, for he said, I am God's son. It's the same mockery that they use against God. And that's what, that in this chapter, it's talking about the wicked oppressing the righteous because they think that life is useless. But let me actually jump into the whole of the book, the structure, how it's built, the arguments, and how it views everything. So it's broken up into three main sections. I'm so sorry. Looking at my notes and seeing that the first section ends in chapter 5. Well, actually, the scholar, Michael Kolkarkic, in this annotated version, splits it up differently. He splits it up to three sections, but I looked at how other people split it up, and I liked their split up more. So this author splits it up more based on the Greek genre and style, which I'm not so familiar with. I'm more familiar with just Second Temple Judaism. So, as with a lot of texts, there are a lot of different scholars that have different ways of breaking texts up. And so there's not always necessarily just one way to break up a text. But just so that you know, and I'm not going to add any more to this, I'm just going to say this is how he breaks it up. Is he says that the first section is chapter 1 through chapter 6 verse 21. He says that that's an exhortation to love justice in order to avoid death and to gain immortality. He sees chapter 6 verse 22 through chapter 11 verse 1 as a praise of divine wisdom, which makes one friends with God. And then 11:2 through 19:22, that's the end. It's the exodus from Egypt and slavery as an example of the providence of God. With all that said, I actually break this up as chapters 1 through 5, and I'll get into these, but right now I'm just going to say what the chapters are. 1 through 5, and 6 through 9, and 10 through 19. So, how do these different sections differ? So the book opens up addressing kings and rulers. It calls them to love wisdom and justice and let it guide them in their every decision. God did not create evil or death, and this is repeated throughout it, but it's said especially first here. God did not create evil or death, so anyone who does evil should not expect to receive wisdom from God, but they're actually just going to create death and destruction for themselves. However, the wisdom with which God first created and ordered the world is still observable and available to anyone who he finds to be right today. Next, we see kind of how the wicked people think, and this is especially in chapter 2, as we just read. They say, life is short and sad, and we are only alive because of random chance. And when we die, nothing that we did will even matter. So the evil plan on how to take advantage of the little time they have left, they'll spend it on all the luxury and pleasure, but even that will not be enough. They have to oppress and take advantage of the poor and the widow and lower in society. They say to those that do what is good and right, they say that they're inconvenient for them, and they hate them because they call them out for the evil that they do, and they claim to be a child of God. So they plan to insult and to attack them and to kill them shamefully. But the evil are unaware of God's plans, that humans will live forever, and so they will be judged for their evil, and the good will receive what's good for the good that they've done, and that all humans are images of God. The wise and just people, however, are protected by God. Even though they may seem to suffer, they know that they have hope in God, that he will save them from their suffering. They learn from discipline and become better. They will even be made glorious and be rulers over nations. When people trust in God, they know that he has ultimate control and the last word, and they are enabled to live faithfully to his wisdom. In the end, God will punish the evil and rescue the just and give them immortality. So as you see, kind of the common theme for 1 through 5 is immortality. The wicked think there's no immortality, they're not going to live forever, so they do whatever they want. And not only does that mean indulging in pleasures, but it also means taking advantage of and even going out of their way to oppress the righteous. But on the flip side of things, the righteous know that they live forever. They know that they're children of God, and that's how they live, in righteousness and in doing what's right. And this is a very important theme that's going to be explored much more in the latter half of this text. But it's first stated here, kind of this idea that the bad that comes upon the bad, God is not doing that bad. That's the people are doing evil, and that evil is coming upon their own heads. And the same for the just. They do what's just, and God gives them goodness for it. And when oppression happens, it doesn't keep that out of the picture. That's totally in the picture that the righteous will suffer, but they have a hope in immortality and living forever and being with God and eventually being rewarded for what they did right. So also the scholar that makes the annotations, Michael Kolarczyk, says that this is actually chiastic. In his structure, again, it's 1 through 621. The first part it opens with an address to judges to love righteousness. And then he says that it ends with an address to kings to learn wisdom. Inside of that, it shows the erroneous reasoning of the ungodly. And second to the end, it shows the confession of the ungodly in the final judgment. And in the center, there's a defense of virtue and justice. So that's just what he has to say for his own breaking up of the text and structuring of it. If in case you favor that. Anyways, in the next section, chapters 6 through 9, it opens up with an address to kings to listen and to love wisdom, similar to the opening of the first section. And again, if you take his structuring of the book, then you see this rather as the end of the first section rather than the beginning, because it's a chiasm. For him, however, he doesn't think that there's two chiasms, but he doesn't think that there's three chiasms, that each section is chiastic, but he does believe that there is a chiasm for a large part of the second section, before I get into what I believe the second section is and its main themes. He says that birth and mortality of Solomon is the beginning of it, and in the end it shows how as a child Solomon recognizes that only God is the giver of wisdom. In between that, it shows that wisdom is greater than any other good, and second to last, it shows wisdom grants fame and success. Third, it shows how God knows wisdom and imparts knowledge, and third to last, it shows how Solomon desires that wisdom. And fourth, right smack in the middle, is a eulogy for wisdom, in his opinion. Now, the next section opens up with an address to kings to listen and to love wisdom. Kings have been given their authority over the nations by God and can do justice for the poor and oppressed by searching out the wisdom of God and relying on it and living by it. When they live by wisdom, they become just judges. Remember, this is supposedly written by Solomon, and so he is a good king and ruler who did search for justice, and that's why the kingdom prospered under him, and the temple was built, and money like the silver was like useless in that day. And so wisdom, again, it's personified as a beautiful woman who desires to teach anyone who's willing to hear from her. There's a part where Solomon is pretty much like talking about how he loves and wants to marry Lady Wisdom. And whenever people seek her out, they can rescue others and sustain order in their kingdom, much like God did in sustaining in the order of the world. Then it is made clear that Solomon is the speaker. He's just an ordinary person like everyone else who was born vulnerable. But he prayed and he asked God to give him wisdom. Again, that's 1 Kings 3, 4 through 14, and 2 Chronicles 1, 6 through 12. He loves wisdom more than money or other good things, And knowing that he would become king, he asked God for God to give him, to guide him and show him how to rule with justice. He recognizes that God rules the world in justice and desires to understand the meaning behind his way so he can rule just like God. Now, remember how God created the world with wisdom in Proverbs 8? Like I talked about earlier, well, the wisdom of Solomon takes this one step forward in saying that she is the breath of God's power and a pure reflection of the glory of the Almighty. And she is a reflection of eternal light and a spotless mirror of the work of God and image of his goodness. That's 8:25 and 8:26. Wisdom is paradoxically portrayed as an attribute distinct from God, yet coming from God's very self and reflecting his essence at the same time. So even think about Hebrews chapter 1, verses 2 through 3, where it talks about Jesus being the imprint of God, if that's what I remember being, or kind of like the seal that a stamp would use. And it says, yeah, it's pretty much talking about distinct from God and yet God. Very close to Proverbs 8, Hebrews 1, and 2 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians 3:18. And so, anyways, this section is concluded with another prayer of Solomon, asking for God to give him the same wisdom that he used to create the world. And this is what he says. He says, "O God of my ancestors and Lord of mercy, who have made everything by your word and by your wisdom. You have formed humanity to have dominion over the creatures you made and rule the world in holiness and righteousness and to pronounce judgment in uprightness of soul. Give me the wisdom that sits by your throne." Again, that's very close to Trinitarian thinking. "And do not reject me from among your servants." That's chapter 9, verses 1 through 4. And with that, we move into the final section, chapter 10 through the last chapter, which is 19. The final section of the book applies the ideas found earlier to the Torah to explain what wisdom looked like in the stories of the Bible. It shows how God brought deliverance to the just and judgment on the wicked according to their deeds. But instead of saying God did it, it simply says that it was Lady Wisdom. So remember how God created humans in God's image? That was actually wisdom. The judgment of Cain and the Nephilim in Genesis 6 and 4, wisdom again. Abraham, Lot, Isaac, Jacob, and all of Israel coming out of Egypt, it's all wisdom. And so it's as if wisdom was the one acting on God's behalf in administering justice and acting in the world. And it goes even further in depth on how wisdom does that through exploring the stories found in Israel's Exodus and wilderness stories. The way that wisdom administers justice is by granting to Israel the needs that were taken away from the Egyptians on account of their evils. So, for example, this is what it says in 11:5. "For through the very things by which their enemies were punished, they themselves received benefit in their need." So, for example, the Egyptians were punished with their water being made undrinkable when it was turned into blood, while Israel enjoyed water coming from a rock when they were thirsty in the wilderness. He sent animals to destroy Egypt in plagues, but those same animals also went in front of Israel to win their wars against their nations ahead of them, and were also the food that they ate, the quails. Again, animals tormented the Egyptians, but were miraculously provided as food for Israel. Wisdom rained down fire and hail over Egypt, but it rained down heavenly bread over Israel. There was an intense darkness over Egypt that caused terror, but a bright light where Israel was, and a pillar of fire to guide them in their way out of Egypt. And so this last section is full of other examples of how wisdom uses one thing to bring punishment for the evil as well as protection for Israel. This is not a pro-Gentile text at all. That's it's one downside. But in my opinion, this just makes the text so profound, not just in how it reads not just in its principles and how it understands wisdom and punishment and retribution, but also how it interprets it. In my in my opinion, in a very based way, very much based on the text. But it actually gets even crazier because another interesting part about the book is how wisdom is presented as punishing the wicked. So the wicked do evil against the just, but through wisdom, that same evil that they do against the just comes upon themselves. And notice this is, there are other examples. It goes through Genesis as well for some time, but it spends the vast majority of its time on the Exodus and wilderness wanderings. Again, so all this is highlighted from these same stories, and again, especially the 10 plagues. So, for example, the Egyptians were evil in drowning all the male Israelite babies in the Nile. And so wisdom reversed that by turning the Nile to blood and in destroying Egypt in the Nile. Or, sorry, not in the Nile, in the Red Sea. My apologies. Also, the Egyptians worshipped animals. So, wisdom sent animals against them to attack them and to punish them. And now this is an interesting thing because we know that Philo is from Alexandria because he just straight up talks about it. He talks about the rulers of his time and where he lives and about his community. And Philo is an author 50 years after this. Well, he's born 50 years after this text is written and starts writing a little bit later in his life. But this is almost definitely written in Alexandria, Egypt. If you don't know, there were, and I know I'm taking a huge aside here, but there were two main centers for Judaism. Jews were dispersed all throughout the known world after the exile, but especially after the time of Alexander the Great, there were two big centers. There were the Jews that were in Palestine, Israel. I'm talking about the physical location, the area. So Judea and Samaria. Samaria was the Samaritans, of course. And then there were a lot of Jews in a city in Egypt called Alexandria. And it was a very deeply Greek city. And now these Jews, they really didn't like Egypt. If you read Philo of Alexandria, for example, he just like lets into Egypt and talks about how it's just like the word, like it's all in his commentary on the Torah on how Egyptians just give into their passions, how they're so evil and oppressing the Jews. And he's seen some stuff. If you read his his treatises on Gaius and Flaccus and how they totally just oppress and try to destroy the Jews in Alexandria, you can see why they hate Egypt. And so, again, that's probably why Wisdom of Solomon is read, because they probably didn't have it way better. It's written to rulers, again, supposedly, though they probably didn't actually hand this to rulers. This is actually probably for the Jews in Alexandria to understand that when rulers do rule by this wisdom, then there is justice and there is order and there's good in society, just like when God created the world in wisdom, the world was ordered and it was good. And so it's to also inspire them. Know how it talks about the suffering righteous. Well, kings are probably not going to suffer that much from being oppressed by other people because they have the power. And so this is really written to the Jews in that community to be encouraged by that. And so another thing is they talk about how Egyptians worshipped animals. They were infamous for that. And the fact that they pointed that out and had that experience with seeing Egyptians worshiping animals is another hint that this was written in Alexandria, Egypt. And again, it was a very Greek Hellenized area. And people like Plato already had the concept of kind of this divine mediator, like the Logos, and Stoicism also, which is heavily influences Philo of Alexandria. And so that kind of paved the way for this. This is a very Hellenistic, which means Greekified Jewish writing. So anyways, that's a big aside. But going back into how they see evil, it's that the Egyptians worshipped animals, and so wisdom sent animals against them to attack them and to punish them. So again, when I'm talking about the animals attacking them, I'm talking about the plagues of the gnats and the locusts and the frogs. And also the Egyptians destroyed all the firstborn of Israel. And so wisdom destroyed all of their firstborn in the last plague. All in all, the Wisdom of Solomon explores how the wisdom of God has been alive and active throughout history. It shows how wisdom guides those that fear and follow God by giving them hope for the life to come. On the other hand, wisdom gives over to those that do evil the natural consequences of the evil that they do to others. This is how wisdom works throughout the world to do justice and rightly respond to the evil and good in the world. It's the very evil that the wicked do to the good that God brings upon themselves as their punishment, and simultaneously uses that same evil as an agent of salvation for those who fear him. That's the wisdom of Solomon. So thank you again for listening to this podcast. I hope that you enjoy it. And if you do, make sure to give it a review and share it with anyone that you think would be interested. Again, all my resources are on my website, found in the description of this podcast episode, thebibylonian.com or michaeljlight.com. Works and writings and apocrypha and other notes, other essays, everything you might want to know that I've written or read, you can find it all on my website. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time in Babylonian.